moving forward with it. So we're really excited about this week's events. We hope you participate in more than just tonight. And we'll be around all evening if you have any questions or anything else. And thanks again for you two and to the Chamber for putting tonight on.
Thank you, Carly. That's great. I'm Nathan Norris. This is Peter Swift. And what we're going to do is I'm essentially going to be asking Peter some basic questions. I want to thank everybody for coming out, but I didn't learn until just a few minutes ago that you guys are really lucky because they cut off attendance at this event. It was literally sold out, and they said no more can come in. So that's a great sign that so many people are interested enough to come hear a bunch of nerds talk about streets. So that is progress in this community. We're very excited about it. So we're going to talk about, Peter's going to talk about the future of transportation. And there's a couple things that we want to start with, and that is this is on the heels of just last year we adopted the comprehensive plan, and it set out a vision for the community that called for changing essentially how we grow. The hope was that we would grow in centers and that we would connect people with greater connectivity and other things. At the same time, we adopted the Downtown Action Plan for the downtown area. One of the second initiative out of the 5 initiatives for that was to go ahead and help change the character of some of the roads that surround the downtown. Because right now, some of those roads were retrofitted a long time ago to essentially get faster cars moving through, and they sort of disconnected the downtown from some of the surrounding neighborhoods. So we'll be working on that. In fact, Peter Swift is working with us right now on exploring what different options might be considered as we move forward to tackle those issues. You may remember over the last year and a half that we've had Joe Minicozy on the left and Chuck Marone on the right to come to Lafayette to talk about how we could create a tool that would help us make decisions about how we make transportation infrastructure investments and other types of investments of infrastructure. And in fact, the city, after they spoke, has hired them to come up with this tool. So instead of simply relying upon politics or traffic demand studies and things of that nature, we're actually going to look at, when we make this investment, how much money are we going to get back? Is this going to actually generate revenue for our community? And so that's very exciting. In fact, we have Josh. Where's Josh? Okay, Josh is he actually works with Joe. He's here this week working with the different folks in LCG making this tool a reality. Ben Hamilton Bailey, how many of you were here to listen to Ben last fall? He was crazy. Okay, he was talking about we could just rip out all our signs and signals and everything was going to be okay. Not exactly, but that was sort of a real fun lecture to see because he was actually showing us videotape of this stuff working. It wasn't a study he was showing. He was just saying, look, it works. Babies aren't dying. We need to think about different ways to do things. Then we had, in November, we had Dan Burden right here. He came and visited us. And if you remember this slide from his presentation, he was talking about how most of our roads right now are just geared toward this left sort of container of just worrying about cars. Okay, but the purpose of streets to him was, well, they can be about a lot more things than just the cars. They can be about people walking around or people biking or about the places that get created or places to recreate. Streets can either support that or take away from that. Then, guess what we've got? We've got the chamber making big changes along the way, becoming a regional chamber of commerce. And one of their primary initiatives is going to be revitalizing the region's core. And that just happens, one of the key elements to implementing a change or an enhancement to the core is changing how we deal with some of our streets. Not all of our streets, but some of our streets can be dealt with in different ways. So that's a good thing. So my first question for you, Peter, is, we've got everything saying that, we need to change how we do business. And we've got this capacity and character issue. Right now, we showed this image thanks to Mike. He showed that Mike Ollier had this photo in his office when I first met him about 2 years ago. I was like, what city is that from? I hadn't been here long enough to know that was Lafayette. And so what we know through the comprehensive plan process is that there have been plenty of people who said, we don't like the congestion. We don't like the traffic. We think some of our thoroughfares are very ugly. We'd like to be more presentable. We'd like to do something about it. So my question is actually, I thought this was somewhere else because this is common all over the United States.
This is how we've been developing a lot of our street. We've been building this with taxpayer money, left and right, all over the United States. It could be anywhere in the United States. And my question is, why could this be anywhere in the United States, and why do we have this today?
Thanks, Nathan. A little bit of historical perspective. There were highway commissions that were developed around the time that Model Ts were being manufactured in the tens of thousands into the 1920s, into the 1930s. The Institute of Transportation Engineers formed in 1930 after a decade or two of problems that occurred. And the problems were because the materials in the roadway were not adequate, the increase in congestion in vehicles, safety problems, pedestrians being hit, horses being spooked, that kind of thing. Early on in the 1910s, 1920s, began to change, 1930s, it was seen that it was important to start developing some kind of standards to control traffic, control the operations of vehicles. Coming into the 1950s, post-World War II, a lot of things changed. Cheap mortgages for returning veterans, huge housing projects, the beginning truly of suburban sprawl, then ultimately the highway programs interrupting usually the poor neighborhoods in larger cities. That is to say, Ike Eisenhower in the 1910s at one point, when he was a young officer, was tasked with moving some materials from coast to coast across the U.S. It took him 58 days to get from California to the East Coast. And then when he became president, he became a real advocate of interstate highway programs. He began to see that the transportation of goods from one place to another was very important. At the same time, the Green Book began to evolve. I think, there you go. And it was seen that design standards, kind of universal design guidelines and standards needed to be developed for traffic engineers, for civil engineers, for municipalities, keeping in mind that these are guidelines. This is not an ordinance, this is not a federal requirement. They are good guidelines. There are a lot of things in the Green Book that are very important. This is a picture of the 1990 edition. A friend of mine, Rick Chelman, an engineer, at one point wanted to understand historically how some of these design guidelines evolved. Well, it turns out that the committee putting together the Green Book was composed of a whole bunch of county officials in rural counties in the U.S. and not necessarily engineers involved in this, very few involved in this. So the thrust of the Green Book from the very beginning was rural in context, it was relatively high speed, there was a lot of important data that came out of this that engineers could use to calculate design standards for themselves, but ultimately the thrust was rural in nature. It was related to the New Jersey highway standards, it was related to county needs, it was not particularly urban. So my friend Rick went down to Washington, D.C. to listen to the old tapes on how they determined some of these standards. Here's how the discussion went. One guy said, well, I think it should be 10. The other guy said, no, it should be 14. I really think it should be 14. And they said, oh, hell, make it 12. And a lot of the discussions in the design standards were more of a discussion and a compromise without the rigor being applied to a lot of the standards themselves. Now, the rigor was applied to how many degrees should you cant the roadway surface for high-speed turning, for example. What about friction on the tires and the roadway interface? What about other elements? Those were fine. Those were done pretty rigorously, and they were done empirically, largely with vehicles that were very heavy, some of them without power steering in the 1950s. So some of those standards can be revised also at this point. So what happened then? Now we move up to the 2001 edition. Notice the cover has changed, a little bit more stylish. And at the top we have this beautiful scene of an urban environment. Curious to me and somewhat ironic in that this was basically a high-speed rural highway approach from the very beginning. of the development of the Green Book itself. More appropriate is a picture in the bottom of the cover, the highway interchange, one way or another. One of the things that we have to understand is that a design manual is not etched in stone. Almost every regulation I've come across, whether it's by ordinance in a municipality and adopted by a municipality, or it's a federal standard that evolves one way or another. Federal Highway Administration calls their volumes, their design volumes, design guidelines. These are guidelines. Engineering judgment is explicitly stated in many of these regulations, including states' boards of registrations. It's up to the engineer to use their education and experience to make judgments individually on what they think is safe, what they think is efficient, and so on. So if we keep that in mind, every time we look at the regulations, whether it's for this city or whether it's for the federal highway projects or it's for anything like this, they're almost exclusively guidelines. However, the landscape is changing in terms of the guidelines and regulations that we're able to work with. Here's a quotation from the Department of Transportation Secretary Anthony Fox. We've been planning like it's 1975. In a real sense, our transportation system hasn't caught up with the 21st century. He's absolutely right. Things are changing dramatically, particularly towards sustainability and multimodality. This comes from a report called the
Can you tell them what multi?
Oh, I'm sorry.
That's a little.
We're going to get into this in the next couple of slides too, but we find that within the public right-of-way, for example, there's been an exclusive focus on the automobile and the truck. That modality, that mode, the car or the truck itself. As we change our perspective on dealing with this, we look at multimodality, which is bicyclists, pedestrians, people in wheelchairs, children, the old who don't have licenses, in addition to vehicles. It's a shared environment. It's a multimodal environment that goes along with the precepts of sustainability that we feel that are so important. This is a very important diagram. This is almost like the Watson-Crick DNA kind of spiral here at this point. This comes from the Green Book, from the AASHTO Green Book. And it looks at two elements in three different types of functional classification of our roadways. We only have three types: arterials, collectors, and local streets, either in an urban or a rural context. Then they take a look at mobility and land access. Mobility, of course, means speed, deals with capacity, deals with the efficiency of moving vehicles as a priority through their car sewers, whether those car sewers are arterials or collectors or local streets. As we get down to the local level, land access becomes a little bit more common, more driveway cuts, more intersections, for example, that kind of thing. But the accent here for our arterials and collectors moving through our communities at regular intervals is mobility, the mobility of vehicles. And in fact, pedestrians are described in the AASHTO Green Book as friction. So now you get the picture on exactly what the accent is and what has been traditionally the accent of any of these kinds of design manuals. Another thing we look at is a measure of performance, like a report card, from A to F. A, of course, is very good. F is a failure. And they've assigned this to traffic performance. For example, level of service A is nothing but light traffic, free flow speeds. You hardly have to look in your mirror to change lanes. It's basically an empty thoroughfare. Level of service D is where speeds are reduced. Lane changes are restricted due to traffic. But what we found is that urbanistically, level of service D is the very best for us. Drivers are driving more slowly through, say, Main Street. They can look into the windows of retail operations and say, oh boy, I could sure use some lunch. I'm going to pull over and get some lunch here. We're traveling slow enough. The capacity on the streets are very high. When we look at level of service E and level of service F, gridlock with frequent stops at F and that kind of thing, a difficult situation. When I was working in Truckee, California, we had come across a group of people who were fighting for level of service F in Tahoe. Because the alternative in adding lanes and turning lanes and that kind of thing through their community was completely unacceptable, and they were all tolerating level of service F. Each of these at a signalized intersection has a certain variable. In other words, you're only delayed for 10 seconds here. You're delayed for 80 seconds here. With these kinds of sharp distinctions, if I were a traffic engineer and said, well, I'm coming up with 59 seconds worth of delay. Oh, you're a level of service D. But wait a minute, my project adds 3 vehicles. I lose another second. Now I'm level of service E. Unacceptable. You have to add lanes, turning lanes. We have to make all these so-called improvements. It's a very thin margin in there somehow. What I'm suggesting is that these kinds of rigid standards are not an appropriate way to measure performance. It's changed dramatically in some other jurisdictions. For example, Magazine Street in New Orleans. It's operating at a level of service varying from level of C to level of service F. It's a beloved place. People love to be here. Pedestrians, bicyclists, little kids running around, and vehicles. It operates well. But you know what? It's illegal. Under many codes at this point, you can't build this kind of thoroughfare. It's not going to happen. So we developed an approach to this also in terms of emergency access. This is North Robertson Street in New Orleans. Firefighters are pulling up. Notice how they've extended the ladder for an aerial attack at this point. Here's an engine company with the hoses. The firefighters in New Orleans confront all kinds of urban conditions successfully. They rescue people, they put out fires. It's important to understand that the public safety aspect of the direction of sustainability that we want to go into can be accommodated by our first responders very easily, if they're trained for it. So what is the result of functional classification, level of service? Ignoring context and character. This is a very important element. Because if we're dealing with multimodal, shared public right-of-way environments in an urban context, we have to bring character into this. It's good for us economically. It works for us socially, where we can have gathering places and meeting our friends and discussing the important issues of the day, for example. And yet, the easy way to approach this is to drive on a conventional suburban development type, with all our ordinances and our design guidelines oriented towards this. It's hard to do this. And in fact, in some places it's illegal, and you have to go through a protracted process of trying to get exceptions to build something in an appropriate and sustainable fashion. Another aspect that we look at is the safety and noise consequences of suburban versus urban environments within the right-of-way. This is the abbreviated injury severity chart, 0 of impacting pedestrians by vehicles. It's a consequence, this study was done as a consequence of pedestrians being hit. Then they studied what happened for a year after the accident itself. On this graded scale, 6 represents a fatality, 0 is no injury at all. And this is what happens at various speeds. What we find here is that at the fatality of 6.0, every pedestrian you hit at 36 miles an hour dies. So this kind of long-term study informs us that a suburban sprawl kind of environment, a cul-de-sac subdivision, people driving 35, 36 miles an hour, they hit somebody and they'll kill them. What happens when we bring this down to between 4 and 5 on the AIS severity index? We're getting hit by 28 to 30 miles an hour. Under these circumstances, you put people in wheelchairs for the rest of their life. Permanent neurological damage, spinal cord transection, organ failure. All these things happen at about 30 to 34 miles an hour. This is a severe consequence. If we are to develop public spaces within our street systems that encourage pedestrian activity, people crossing the street, that kind of thing, we must keep the speeds down to about 22 to 25 miles an hour. At this level of injuries, maybe a broken toe, maybe a sprained wrist, maybe some lacerations. So keeping that in mind, we also have to deal with the consequences of noise. We know from studies from the Federal Highway Administration that if you have vehicles moving at 30 or 35 miles an hour next to a sidewalk, you're talking to a friend on the sidewalk, you have to speak louder. You have to get closer to each other to be heard when these vehicles, the noise from the tires is hitting you at 30, 35 miles an hour. 25 miles an hour, the background, the ambient noise is not enough of a distraction so that you have to make changes in the way that you speak to your friends. That's important also because if you're going to have a cafe out there, you want to talk to your neighbors and friends on the sidewalk, you want to make sure your kid isn't running out between the cars and you yell at them, that they can be actually heard. The landscape is changing. Level of service in California is now being abandoned by the California Department of Transportation. This is an excellent move. Jerry Brown is actually doing some wonderful things with changing the regulations, dealing with transportation in California. Instead, they look at something called vehicle miles traveled. In other words, you multiply the traffic volume by the number of miles you travel for your trips. Why is this important? Because we don't want these trips to be too long, consuming gas, air pollution, and so on and so forth. So if we have VMT, vehicle miles traveled, that are beginning to decrease, we have a much more sustainable condition to deal with, and it's a much better way, a much better metric to deal with traffic performance and understanding traffic performance. What else is happening? This is a very important document. Designing walkable urban thoroughfares, a context-sensitive approach. It was done with cooperation of the Institute of Transportation Engineers and the Congress for the New Urbanism. The Federal Highway Administration was also involved in this and others. It took years to get this design manual put together. It abandoned the 12-foot wide lane. It changed the metrics on how we deal with context, with character, actually introducing urban context and character into the way we view the design of our thoroughfares. It's the first time this has happened in the history of transportation. It's an extremely important event. Your downtown here is absolutely wonderful. It's such a great place to walk. Some of the examples that have been taken for this manual come from places exactly like this. It's socially sustaining, it's economically sustaining, it's environmentally sustaining. The next one is NACTO, Urban Street Design Guide. Another important document that's moving in the appropriate direction. You know what's more important than simply getting these documents put together is their adoption by regulating agencies, whether it's the city, the county, the parish, the federal government. The state of Texas has adopted this one. Okay? I think Michigan has also adopted it, and several other states, the departments of transportation, have adopted it as an alternative. So if you want to build a beautiful place, like you have right outside the doors of this theater, you can do it through these kinds of design guidelines. Very important to understand that these are justifiable from a legal sense, from a design sense, from a commonsensical point of view, and defensible in all those ways.
You must have hold on to that.
Recently, Peter, we've had, and I believe I had to miss it during lunch today, but Monique is here. You talked about complete streets, didn't you, today? Okay, so what we want to be able to do is, even though we're not there, talk about the difference between complete streets and context-sensitive streets. Do they always overlap or not?
is the question. And so is it basic question is it enough to have a complete street?
Complete streets movement came out of a lot of the work that was done by engineers like Rick Chellman and Appleyard's work in San Francisco and a number of others. It is kind of an offshoot from what we understood to be context-sensitive types of design. Complete streets will, for example, come into a corridor like this and add some bike lanes with some colored pavement on the side, striping, that kind of thing. And that's fine for the bicycle community. That's good. They've got a route, perhaps it's safer for them. It doesn't necessarily slow down traffic. It doesn't necessarily deal with the context outside of the right-of-way. Don't get me wrong, complete streets is an important step forward, but in my view, it isn't complete. It isn't complete in terms of context. It isn't complete in being able to understand the environment in which these changes are to be made, one way or another. They have details about A, B, and C zones on sidewalks and where you put street furniture and that kind of thing. And again, it's an important step. But unfortunately, there isn't really a particularly great understanding of the context in a sustainable fashion we would like to see. Now, look at this context. There's a couple of things that are so important here to understand in dealing with a place, actually, that needs to be like a magnet for non-vehicle users, bicyclists, pedestrians, so on and so forth. And what are these things? One of the things is enclosure, the distance between the buildings, how landscaping and architecture can actually enclose these spaces. What we found in studies that were done a number of years ago is that if a building is as tall as they are far apart, it's the most comfortable pedestrian environment. That's a one-to-one relationship. It's as high as they are far apart. 2-to-1, 3-to-1 relationships work well. 4-to-1 is good for plazas, for example. But the space must be enclosed for people to be comfortable within that space. It's an attractor for pedestrians, not motorists. Another thing is parking. Having 3,000 pounds of steel between the sidewalk and the moving vehicle. It also helps mitigate some of the noise. It also helps slow vehicles down. Trees and landscaping is extremely important. We found in a study in Florida that a mature canopy of trees over a thoroughfare can slow traffic between 5 and 8 miles an hour. Put that together with the slower traffic in these enclosed environments, or perhaps a median down the center of the road, can act as a refuge for people that are crossing the road. You can cross mid-block and stop on the median and look to your right and make sure it's safe to follow, to walk across the last lane. So all these things in terms of context must apply. Architecture is important too, not in terms of the style as much as the fact that on retail and commercial areas, there's some transparency, permeability. You can look into the store. You can see what kind of activity is there, what kind of products they have, that kind of thing. One thing we notice, if you have just townhouses next to a sidewalk, the sidewalk is close to it, the head of a person sitting in the chair in the townhouse needs to be higher than the head of the person walking on the sidewalk. What we noticed in so many places is that the curtains are closed when somebody sitting is lower than those walking next to the window. The curtains are open when sitting in a chair, your head is higher than those walking on the sidewalk adjacent. It's things like that. It's that context. It's that design approach, derived empirically, to develop appropriate context and appropriate sustainable urban places. Okay, how to transform character. This is characterless. There's nothing here. You wouldn't send your kid walking down this arterial by themselves to pick up a carton of milk. It would be unsafe. It would be uncomfortable. What makes these things comfortable? First of all, in this context, we've got a textured center in the roadway itself. We've got narrower lanes. We've got lanes that are less than 12 feet wide, maybe 10 or 11 feet wide, with exception under extraordinary circumstances, maybe 9. We've got parking on the street itself, development of landscaping. You see that these old buildings that were there previously still maintain themselves. The next element, of course, is enclosure. Take a look at the wonderful 1-to-1, 2-to-1 relationship here with these buildings. Very different feel to it. People drive significantly slower under those circumstances. Pedestrians begin to appear on the wider sidewalks, cars and parking, buffering them from the moving traffic, which is still going slowly.
All right, we're making progress. We're halfway there. We've got 4 designated questions for them, so we're on question number 3. And the question is, well, this all sounds great, but why aren't we seeing dramatic change everywhere? Why isn't everybody adopting these things you're talking about?
The first thing is the money. Follow the money. If, for example, we take a look at the top of the food chain of highway kinds of projects, a lot of the time, federal money is involved in this. And if federal money comes with it, so do federal guidelines. You want $100,000, you want $50 million for a highway project. I-49, grade separated. It's going to cost a lot of money to build this stuff. Well, the feds have a great deal of interest to have you work with their design guidelines if you accept their money. This may also be true of the parish or the county, in that they may have certain expectations. If they do a long-range plan, if they say, this is where the highways are, this is where the freeways are, this is where the arterial streets should be within your area, and you want money from me, well then you're going to conform to our plan. And it's going to be, generally, auto and truck driven. How efficient can we move automobiles and trucks through these types of corridors? So the money and the strings attached to the money is part of the problem. Another thing is some people think that the standards are etched in stone, like the Green Book. There are a lot of engineers, staff members, even elected officials who fear, here are our standards. An engineer comes in and says, well, we want to do it a little differently. We want them safer. We want them to be traveling slower. We want to develop, bring buildings up to the street. We want medians. We want these kinds of things. No. That's not in our standards. I don't have a cross-section in my book of cross-sections that allows you to do that, therefore you can't do it. Regardless of how rigorous the argument is by the engineer, to say there are all these good and sufficient benefits. We must do it this way. No. It's our standards. Etched in stone, cannot change. Every standard can change. One of the things that really helps with municipalities changing this is to develop new standards, as we had shown in the early design guidelines and our newer design guidelines, and adopt these as an ordinance. It's part of your actual regulations. What we found is that when they're given as an exception, as a special district or something like that, you're a little bit more open to litigation. When you adopt these new standards and these new plans by ordinance and bring them into the body of your ordinances, governmental immunity has a much stronger position. So it's important to recognize that these can change and they can be adopted in an appropriate way. Feeling legal today, Tom? Well, do you? Litigation and the threat of litigation is a problem under these circumstances. Again, adopting these standards based on the latest work in sustainable traffic engineering, which we showed you earlier, reinforces the position of governmental immunity and to protect the citizens and the government from arbitrary, sometimes, litigation. Protect yourself. Citizens and politicians simply don't know what is happening with the dynamics of sustainable traffic engineering and sustainable design. To a large extent, it's not their fault. An educational approach by those who have the vision to develop a sustainable community, bring sustainability into their existing community, is important. And I've seen a lot of city councils, for example, that say, we want excellent streets, we want greater economic activity, we want multimodal activity, bicycles and pedestrians and so on and so forth in our downtown. We want to have this happen. That's great. They hire a consultant. The consultant goes out and says, we're going to have narrower streets, we're going to have landscaping, we're going to have all these good and sufficient things that we propose to bring in and make it sustainable. Go back to the city. The city said, wait a minute, that's not in our regulations. Well, that's because largely the regulations are written to accommodate the vehicle, to accommodate suburban sprawl, frankly. So what has to happen at that point? It's a question of education. Read some of these manuals. Look at case studies. See what others have done. See what interesting projects have developed a great economic base, a great place for people to be, regardless of age, regardless of mobility. Extremely important.
You can read.
So what should we do then?
No, it's a serious question, though. It's, great, that's all great. Maybe we don't need to pay as much attention to level of service. Maybe we need to adopt something. What do we really have to do if we want to see changes? We know that through the existing system, we can fight really hard to get good things to happen. And it just requires a lot. But how can we make this sort of standard operating procedure?
Okay, the first thing, the most important thing is to have a vision for your community. Normally this comes from the elected officials. You vote from people who share a common interest with you. Part of that is the vision of the community. What do you want it to be? What are the good parts of your community that you would like to see in other parts of the community, for example? How would you like to retrofit what has turned into a conventional arterial in the old Main Street and bring it back to its great attraction? Bring it back to a very sustainable, very aesthetically pleasing place that it used to be. There are ways of doing this. But first, you've got to have the vision. And that's got to be supported by their constituency. The constituents and the elected officials say, let's rethink what we're doing here. Let's try to get things done more appropriately for the community. Elected officials then, in that process, say, great, let's bring this vision forward and see what we can do with it. Then it's important to have elected officials particularly understand how they can actually correct the problems. But it's not just techniques in correcting the problems itself, it's also being able to organize and work with the staff. There are experts who will be reviewing any kind of development application, for example, how these things are going to be put forward. And support the best of these types of practices. Having read some literature, looked at some great examples, becoming really versant with what's happening with these techniques, the position of leadership becomes a lot easier, and the outcomes become much more important. So as you protect staff and politicians with the new standards adopted by ordinance, you have this great, you're developing this excellent foundation, this base for you to go ahead and move forward with any of the projects that may be working its way forward within your community. Public works manuals need to be revised. This is the only public works manual that I am aware of for the city of Taos, New Mexico, that weds context, sociability, sustainability in a public works manual with their vision for their community. Little things like these types of cross-sections for narrower streets and how you deal with utilities, water quality, storm drainage, a new way of forecasting traffic that is a little more appropriate for mixed-use sustainable communities, and so on. I think it's the only one that may exist at this point. But I would encourage any municipality or county to look very closely at, as their plans develop, and they have either a smart code or they've got some kind of zoning ordinance that they've massaged to reflect their vision, the next step is to bring their public works manual into conformance with that vision and make sure that it works. Again, from a liability standpoint, it further protects the municipality and the designing engineers, if you will, from litigation.
Peter, let me interrupt real quick. One of the important issues here that I think needs to be highlighted is the fact that these standards typically exist within departments of how they handle things. But it makes it a lot easier when you put the context issue, which is essentially saying if we're going to be dealing with drainage, what are our different options for dealing with drainage when we're in a rural setting as opposed to a suburban setting or an urban? Okay, and the idea is to give the public works folks the different options of how to deal with things in those different contexts, as opposed to just saying, well, you know, we got to do it one way throughout the entire community. And putting it all in one place is a valuable thing, even if you had it in separated areas.
Exactly. And I want to sort of point out again that in the ITE-CNU manual that I spoke of earlier, it deals with context. Half a dozen different kinds of context, from rural to very urban, in a center core like Los Angeles or Chicago or New York. And the whole spectrum of urban environments in between them, they're all classified. And to go to Nathan's point, it helps reinforce the idea that there is context that's important, but there are different contexts that we work with. And this manual, this Public Works manual, is calibrated to do exactly that. And I think it's, I think this is available for free if you Google it. The Taos Public Works Manual. You take a look at it and see what's happening.
Peter likes it a lot. He wrote it. He didn't say it.
Okay, it's $5 a one for everyone. Okay, pilot projects. It's so important. You know, let me take roundabouts as an example. Every place that I've gone into where I wanted to introduce roundabouts as a technique of dealing, slowing down traffic, greater pedestrianism, significant drop in injury accidents, and that kind of thing. And if they haven't had a roundabout there, most of the population said, these are horrible, we don't want them, never mind, forget what's going on here. One of the best examples I know is that huge oval roundabout in Clearwater, Florida, Clearwater Beach. It moves 52,000 vehicles a day for that service. Big trucks, huge trucks, 67-foot long trailers. Saw a bunch of Cub Scouts crossing this thing. No problem, totally safe. But as soon as they built this, then the neighbors came back to the city council and says, wait a minute, I gotta have one of these in my neighborhood, the small ones. And then another one. And then 3 more were built. And then 6 more were built in Clearwater. So to be able to have pilot projects, maybe you take a risk as a politician or a staffer in a municipality, that we're going to experiment with this, we're going to try this. So people can experience it and walk in these environments and understand intimately what is happening there is extremely important. Just do it. And in fact, if you want to do something like a road diet saying, well, we don't have all that much traffic on this 5-lane facility, let's make it a 3-laner. Well, cone it off. Stripe it. Do something really inexpensive. Let it sit there for a while. Let people experience what's happening with it. And then when it appears to be successful at that point, put in more structural improvements. Make them work longer term. That's an extremely important thing, is to experiment a little. Try some of this stuff. That's how we got here today with these manuals. Many experiments. Some of them actually didn't work out. Most of them did. So we learned empirically on how to deal with these kinds of situations. Transit is one of the most important elements of something called transportation demand management strategies. How do you reduce the number of vehicles in a thoroughfare somewhere? Got huge congestion problems, that kind of thing. Transit is, in my view, at the top of the list. Great headways. You have bus service every 10 minutes around the rush hour periods. You cover a huge area around the town with the bus service. City of Boulder is one of the best. The hop, skip, and jump The hop is very concentrated, sort of like in the downtown local neighborhood areas. The skip connects neighborhoods. The jump gets out into the region. It's one of the most successful transit systems in the U.S., bus system. It's very important to do this. Sometimes you need special dedicated lanes, but not often, as long as you have a decent, clean bus service that works. The problem is, a lot of people think that's where the creeps and weirdos go. You know, this is a special conveyance for all the undesirables in your neighborhoods. Well, it's a clean, well-managed system. If you got places that get you out of the rain while you're waiting for the bus, if you're connected to all the neighborhoods within your community, that isn't the case. In fact, it can be really comfortable. In fact, even bus systems have Wi-Fi. Bus systems are great for a commute with a cup of coffee and a newspaper. So it works out quite well that way. Transportation demand management strategy. You are the traffic, ladies and gentlemen. You're not just stuck in somebody else's traffic. If we take a look at what happens with different modes, different ways of travel, we fill up this thoroughfare with cars with one driver each. What is the equivalent? Okay. If we had a bus, all those drivers that you saw on the previous slide could fit on this bus. The street is empty here in this example. What happens if they're turning them into pedestrians? You don't need the cars. This is the same number of drivers that were in the cars in the first slide. You can see the profound difference that transit makes, that walking makes, even bicycling. So taking cars off the street by providing other options is extremely important. Providing a wonderful public realm for the pedestrians, for a comfortable, enjoyable, leisurely day, extremely important. And I want to show you something here. This thoroughfare, in the no-build option, I was looking at the EIS for I-49. And they're predicting by the year 2025 to have between 60 and 80,000 vehicles a day on it. This is 80,000 to 90,000 vehicles a day. Is this unlike I-49? Dramatically. It provides the kind of sustainable approach. I'm not suggesting that you abandon I-49. It's going to happen. It will be built. The important thing we're going to be looking at is the urban interface. How does the urbanism of your community match up with this highway so that it isn't interrupted, that it isn't overbuilt, that you don't have too many high-speed movements getting off of the highway and entering your town? They should be at 25 miles an hour, not 45 or 50 miles an hour. There are ways of doing this. And we're going to be looking at this techniques, making sure that you don't interfere with the neighborhoods as much as you have to, being able to get the urban highway interface done appropriately so that it doesn't interrupt the urbanism that you so appreciate in this town. It's one of the tasks we'll be looking at.
Can you back up 2 slides real quick, Peter? Because I don't think it was perfectly clear.
Okay.
This place where people are feeling very comfortable, fast forward. That's it.
Yeah.
See, they're right next to that traffic, but because of the design details, you know, they look perfectly comfortable. They didn't seem like it was some horrible environment to be close to the cars as they're coming by. So I want to just make that clear. That wasn't as though it's 2 different places.
Yeah, sorry.
That's simple.
Well, you know, another example of this is the Champs-Élysées in Paris. They're running up in some areas of that 16 lanes. You got 4 or 5 lanes around the Arc de Triomphe. They're running up to 150,000 vehicles a day on the Champs-Élysées, one of the most beautiful boulevards in the world. People fly into Paris to be able to walk the Champs-Élysées with 150,000 vehicles a day on it. We know in terms of context and sustainability, we can actually make these things work and make them work successfully. We can actually have it all. Thanks for your attention. Maybe we can take some questions.
Yeah, questions?
Any questions? I have a question.
Oh, well, let me make a comment real quick that's important to note. there are lots of good things going on in this community right now. Not the least of which is that how many people are staff associated with how we design our streets that are here tonight? Come on, admit it. Come on, here, okay. That is a great thing. So these are the people who are going to make it happen as we move forward. And so that's a really good thing.
May I add just one thing to that too? I've had the advantage of dealing with a lot of transportation folks from the Metropolitan Planning Organization, Department of Transportation, local staff, yesterday in 3 hours of meetings. And of the 35 states that I've worked in maybe 13 or 14 foreign countries, I was delighted to deal with every one of them. Their understanding of these techniques, their forthrightness, cooperative attitude, wanting the best for this community, honestly was incredibly refreshing. I'm not used to this. I'm used to combat. But what we found here was an approach that was so delightful, I was smiling through every meeting. So I want to congratulate those who were involved in this process and look forward to seeing how things evolve in the future.
I'm sorry, go ahead.
You had mentioned pilot projects are a great way for municipalities to try out new things. Are there any things in the development or being developed in Lafayette that are being implemented as pilot projects or being considered as pilot projects around Lafayette?
Well, there's a couple, and maybe one of the staff members may want to talk about it, but one of the things that I know that they're going through the process on right now is the conversion of bird training. Can we talk about that, Kevin?
Sure. You want me to talk about it?
Sure.
Kevin Benjamin, I'm the Public Works Director. Bertrand Drive, the section from the horse farm to college is a state highway. We're going to be taking it in as part of the right side of the program. What you got there is a traditional 4-lane, old state highway. It actually only carries about as much traffic as one of our average collector 2-lane roads. And so the state is actually going to be restriping that road any day now to add some bike lanes to go down to 2 lanes, turn lane in the middle, sort of the initial complete streets option that Mr. Swift was talking about. But we do have identified about $1.5 million, $2 million to do a streetscape project along there that is more of a context-sensitive approach where we'll be adding the sidewalks and the bulb outs and pedestrian features, and not only that, as part of our ongoing unified development code process, where we're rewriting a lot of our current subdivision regs and zoning rules and everything else, that Bertrand Drive corridor has the potential to develop in a different way, to develop in a more dense environment with mixed use, so that this does become one of the more walkable urban places in our community. And that's kind of what we're shooting for. We've done some restriping here and there around town. St. Mary through University has been restriped, and after initial about a month of angst, everybody's gotten used to it. Restriped St. Landry. We are trying to take a proactive effort, especially in this next year, of showing folks kind of what we've been talking about through the comp plan, because I think that once people are able to experience that type of change, even if it is an intermittent change, they're able to understand what it is that we're trying to do.
Sometimes you get problems with the public utilities company. I'm not saying that it's happening here, but can you talk a little bit about how communities have addressed the disconnect between what city officials and bureaucrats want to do and what the public utilities or even private utilities sometimes they place their poles in the middle of sidewalks. It's inaccessible for ADA, all this kind of stuff that makes this walkability really difficult. How communities address it, and maybe kind of speak about how Public Works and LUS are kind of looking at Lafayette's landscape to make sure that doesn't happen, or addressing poles that do prohibit sidewalk accessibility.
That is a good point, and especially when you're looking at retrofitting old areas, right? I mean, when you're in a greenfield spot where you've got all the room in the world to work in, and honestly, when you're developing a suburban model, which our only model for the last 40 years has been a suburban model of development, then all the utilities have room to spread out, and everybody gets to suburban model, and in some fashion that will continue to exist. You have all the room that you need to put in your sewer and your gas and your electric and everything else. But if we're going to have a more dense environment, we've got to adjust. And so our departments have been working together. Public Works did a yeoman's task of getting all that work together, figuring out what the new street sections might look like. And right now, LUS is figuring out, okay, in this more condensed environment, when we're going to be building up against the road, and we're not going to have a full 20 feet off the edge of the curb to put our utilities, how are those going to fit? And so, as part of the new UDC, we'll be rolling out that work so that our utility providers, not just LUS, but Cox and Atmos and the rest, will know how they fit. And I've got to say that we've been, after the initial first meeting, the first 20 minutes of the meeting where they say, well, we can't make it fit in 5 feet, after you got through their disbelief, our local group has been, really excited about pushing through with that work and figuring it out. Because I think they understand that what we've been talking about in the comprehensive plan and how we're going to develop in a different way is going to require that amount of institutional change.
One thing I'd like to point out too is that in the City of Dallas Public Works Manual, we address this. Here's the wet utilities like water and sewer. Here are the dry utilities in a common trench, only about 8 inches to a foot apart. All three, electric, telephone, cable, in a common trench, in a sand bed, with yellow tape on top of it, so if you get into repair, you find the tape first, and you know where you're located. Is a very important thing, because a lot of these utilities require like a 5-foot easement or an 8-foot easement individually. And you start adding up the widths of these easements, and you're occupying a huge amount of ground. We've had luck in talking to franchise utilities to be able to provide them not only in the street, but in a common trench. And to be able to reduce the amount of area that you need in the public right-of-way so buildings can move closer to each other, streets can contract somewhat. So it's a very important aspect.
And I'd add, I've been in some of the meetings with LUS specifically, and they have acknowledged the distinction of, okay, when we're in an urban environment, we have to look at things a little differently than a suburban environment. And it's been a refreshing conversation during all those meetings. And, once again, this is, we're heading in the right direction. What I'm really interested in is making it easier for everybody. That's why having something like this that shows the different options that you can consider and how you deal with this issue in this context or that context, I think is really important. Oftentimes the staff folks aren't paid enough to take big risks. So, that's why giving them a document that has the force of an ordinance is so critically important, not just from a legal perspective, but also from the perspective of them being professionals.
Yes, sir.
So you bring up I-49, the record decision to build a 5.5 mile elevated freeway through the center of town, just another mile from here. Are there examples of that being successful in our decade? And New Orleans shows us pictures of Esplanade. They started to remove Isam Claremore, Highway 90 in New Orleans is a homeless camp. How is that being designed and implemented in urban settings these days without destroying those neighborhoods?
Well, that's a really big question. And I don't want to get into, honestly, the political aspect of the whole thing. My understanding is that it's going to be built above grade. My biggest concern is, again, the urban interface. How does it interact with your town? And we've got to do it in a sustainable fashion. You're also talking to a guy who's been working on with a team that wants to knock down I-70 all through North Denver and turn it into a Parisian frontage road boulevard and redirect some of the lanes into other highways. We're talking about the Esplanade in San Francisco after the earthquake was never rebuilt. The highway, the double-decker was never rebuilt. You see the pictures where it collapsed on itself. And instead they came in with this absolutely beautiful boulevard that had the most extraordinary revitalizing effect on all the neighborhoods up and down that corridor. I guess what I'm getting at is that I don't support interstate highways in urban environments. I just don't. I support interstate highways as connectivity between one municipal region and another. but not destroying neighborhoods, not taking out somebody's house or business. That's my personal effect. Now, I don't know much about the situation on I-49 from a developmental standpoint. How did it get to that point? How much do you need? That kind of thing. I haven't done a regional study to find out or to educate myself to what's happening with regional traffic movement around the area either. All I'm saying is that I don't think it works urbanistically, but if you have to have something like that, at least respect the existing urban environment as much as possible, slow down the traffic, make it accessible by non-motorists, and you're much better off.
When you say slow down to what? What's the?
I'd bring it into 25, I would never enter a town greater than 25 miles an hour. You've got to slow it down to a point you can do that through physical design. If you begin to narrow the lanes, you can have some curvature, some signage warning the 50, 60 mile an hour traffic as they depart the highway and descend towards the urban area. Does slow down. To get down to around 25 miles an hour.
And just to be clear, there's 3 municipalities removing elevated interstate highways right now because they don't work in urban environments. Dallas, San Francisco.
Yeah, but you know the history, right? You know the history of what happened beginning with Boston, and Philadelphia. A lot of these East Coast cities that in the 1950s and 60s had these massive highway programs. And they went through the poor neighborhoods and kicked everybody out. And they interrupted the grid, which allows the traffic to disperse within the town itself. Look what happened in Detroit. It's extraordinary what happened to their highway system. So from a philosophical standpoint, I don't support it. There are other ways of handling this. How many times have you been like on I-70 or 80 or I-10 for that matter, and you come near a town and they say business district I-10. And it slows down, and it's calmed down. A lot of the times it turns into a main street, for example. And then outside of town it comes back and joins the high-speed thoroughfare, the high-speed highway. That's a great way to do it. And that's what I'm talking about. Slow the vehicles down. You've seen business bypasses all over the interstate system, right? And they work quite well. Driving one of these highways through existing neighborhoods is something that I object to. I don't think it works well.
John, what we've talked about as it relates to I-49, and it comes essentially from the downtown, right adjacent to the railway, essentially. And the idea is to have the key interface with the downtown is a interchange where you essentially come off on a ramp that allows you to slow down enough so that when you do turn into the downtown, then you're going, once again, no more than about 25. In the same way that, for those of you who are familiar with Baton Rouge, once you go over the Mississippi River from Lafayette, they have Nicholson Drive exit, and you're not going more than 25 when you're curling around on Nicholson. So that's the idea, as opposed to the idea of we're going to be coming 45 miles an hour into Congress. Peter is here, not just to give this presentation, but he's also doing, the LCG funded a study of Congress. And so he's here in his professional capacity to explore what are the different options for dealing with Congress today, because right now we have relatively low traffic volumes on that road for as much capacity as it provides. And it's also, as I talked about in the very beginning, somewhat of a divider between the neighborhood and the downtown. And there's all sorts of latent economic value all up and down that street if you change its character. So that's what we're exploring right now. And by the way, how long can we go? Where's Blair? How long can we go with questions and answers? 2 more questions? Okay, raise your hands high. Flo?
Peter, one of your recommendations to us was case studies so that we could broaden our understanding of the context sensitive. Which communities would you recommend to us that we study that are award-winning in your approach to context sensitive streets?
Well, let me think of something relatively nearby. I worked on the master plan. Let me think. No, it's not far away. Okay, so yeah, there's a project that I worked on with Moule and Palazoidis architects and urbanists from Pasadena, California. Liz Moule ran the charrette. And in the charrette, We were looking at Lancaster, California, their Lancaster Boulevard that went through town. It's 5 lanes. It had a suicide lane in the middle, I mean a two-way center lane. And then 2 lanes on either side plus parallel parking. It was dead. 1.5, 2-story buildings lining this place, a lot of them boarded up, high vacancy rate. So I combined 2 things in my suggestion for the design. One, we take a look at the Ramblas in Barcelona, which is this wonderful pedestrian exclusive center to this roadway with all kinds of activities, great stuff going on, because the people of Lancaster had these wonderful weekend parties where they just shut the whole street down and bring in tents and do all this other stuff. And I said, let's formalize it. Let's take out 3 of the 5 lanes in the center. Turn it into 2 things. One, a plaza, built out of stone or cobble or some other type of material. And then have the different color stones put in there so that you can actually diagonal park in this plaza. Add some lighting, add some trees and landscaping in here. No dedicated left turn lanes at intersections, no dedicated right turn lanes at the intersections. We wound up with 2 functional lanes out of the original 5. We're right next to a fire station. We did turning movement analysis and all that other kind of engineering stuff. Within 2 years after the construction of Lancaster Boulevard, there were $324 million in commercial investment in that 7-mile corridor. And the project won the 2012 EPA Award for Overall Excellence. The amount of money that came into that corridor was staggering. The redevelopment, the nighttime activity began to pick up. They had these wonderful concerts and brought their tents out to their new plaza in the middle of the roadway. The design speed was 15 miles an hour. The actual operating speed is 15 miles an hour back and forth within that corridor. So that'll be something to look into, because it was a radical juxtaposition between the actual regulation on how much traffic they thought they needed to get through this thing. And we road dieted this thing to death. And the traffic dispersed in the grid. The emergency vehicles could actually get from one place to another without a problem. And it was very counterintuitive to a lot of people until it was actually built and functioning. From the economic, environmental, and social aspect, it was a huge success.
Okay, one more question. I was hoping we didn't have to have John have it. All right, John. Oh, by the way, John is giving a presentation tomorrow at lunch on top of, at the top floor of Iberia Bank on how Lafayette can make it big with small development. Go ahead.
I think also to appreciate the case study of Lancaster, you have to really understand what a complete punchline the town of Lancaster was in our whole region. It was a total armpit, terrible place. And now it's that the Rambla is magic. So for all of California, there's kind of a, hey, they did this in Lancaster. Come on. What's your idea? Peter, can you talk about, since this was really geeky, can you talk about induced demand or the theory?
Oh, yeah, sure. Yeah, if it's okay, it's a technical issue, but as John points out, it's a very important issue. There's something called induced traffic. It was first studied by Dr. Chen in 31 counties in California. And what it means is this. If you have 2-lane thoroughfare, and your forecast says you're going to need 4 lanes for this thing, you've got a choice. You build this thing so that it is way over capacity, level of service A. People can change lanes with hardly looking at their mirrors. Very flowing, fluid environment, but it does something to traffic in the region. Drivers in the region say, wow, look at this new facility. I've never had to use that route before, but because it's level of service A, and there's a huge amount of capacity there, I'm going to go there. I don't have to go there, but I'm going to go onto that arterial street. That's induced traffic that does not have to be there, but it is attracted to this because you're adding lanes. Level of service is very A or B. And then what happens is more and more people come into this 4-lane facility until it becomes congested. They say, well, hell, maybe we need a 6-lane facility. This phenomenon was first discovered by Robert Moses in the 1930s when he was director of public works in New York City. A bridge collapsed on the Upper West Side. He sent out his minions to say, wow, we had a lot of traffic on that bridge. Where did the traffic go? They didn't find it anywhere. I worked with that was all induced traffic then. I worked with the NPO in Albuquerque on I-10. It was under construction. They were shutting down a number of lanes on I-10. The NPO, the Metropolitan Planning Organization, went out and did traffic cams on all the arterials and collectors around I-10 to find out where the traffic went, because they had lost up to 30% of the traffic on I-10. Where did it go? It didn't show up at peak hour anywhere around I-10. So the assumption is between 20 and 30% of the traffic on I-10 didn't have to be there. It was induced traffic. This is another element that we have to take a look at with any kind of highway project, even arterial streets. Induced traffic could be a killer. If we overbuild, if we overcompensate, we're just creating problems.
So it's sort of like trying to lose weight by loosening your belt.
Exactly.
There we go. Okay, well, we've got to call up Curly Almlavar, who's the Director of Development for Lafayette Parish in the city.
I just wanted to thank Peter for his time tonight, and we can all
Oh,
hear
wow.
about the